What's up, guys? So most of you know that I've been riding my 350 for most of my off-road rides now, and I have the 56 fork springs in the front of my 690. So since I've been riding on the road, the 690 doesn't settle down in the road very well because the front end's really stiff from my body weight. And so now that I ride it on the road and my off-road is going to be a little bit lighter weight, I'm actually going to switch the front end to a lighter weight fork spring. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to put one of the stock fork springs in and one of the stiffer fork springs in. So I think the stock rate is 48, and so I'm going to mix 148 and 156, and that'll throw me right in the middle of that range with like a, I don't know, 54 or something. Not really very good at doing math in my head, but anyway, that will soften the front end up a little bit so it settles into corners and stuff a little better. And you know, I'm not hitting big bumps and jumps on the 690 anymore, so it should work out a lot better for me as far as rideability and handling on the street. So I don't have time to do an instructional video, but I just wanted to show you what the inside of your 690 fork looks like if you haven't seen one before. So the trick is you loosen the cap while the fork is still in the triple clamp. So you loosen the top triple clamp and leave the bottom one tight, and then once the top one's loose, you can break the fork cap loose. If you don't do that and you try and loosen the fork caps after you take them out of the bike, if they're on tight, you have not very good grip down here on the fork, especially if your hands are oily or something, and so you'll slip and you won't be able to get enough bite on the cap, and you might end up marring the edges of the cap or something. You know, especially if you're not using a metric wrench, which it's a 24, and if you're using a standard wrench, you know, it might mar the aluminum a little bit. So loosen the fork cap while it's in the triple clamp, and make sure that you loosen the top triple clamp first. So the other thing that's super handy is if you can modify a wrench, and this nut here that holds the spring on in the fork cap, actually I should say just holds the fork cap, it's really thin, the surface area. So this wrench, you can see it's thicker here than it is here. This wrench has been ground down so that you can slide it under and hold this nut to take the fork cap off. So the fork cap's off, and I've got this damping rod, and it's a really long aluminum rod. I've got this with one hand, so I'm not going to show you, but you need to be careful. You need to remove this. You can bend it pretty easily, so set it off in a safe place. And then if you're once you take the wrench off, the cartridge, or not the cartridge, the internals, whatever the hell they are, they're going to fall down inside of the fork. And when they do that, sometimes oil will come back out of this hole, and there's a little needle down there. It's the valve needle will sometimes come out of the top of here, and you don't want to lose that or drop it down inside of the fork or something, because that's really bad. So make sure that you're conscientious of when you take this out and when the fork leg drops, that you don't lose that little needle thing. So the other thing I'm going to do while I'm in this fork is I'm going to lower the fork oil level to 120 millimeters. I thought that it's probably about 100 right now, because that's where I tried to set it with a ruler, but I've since I did the fork springs, I went to the mainland and retrieved some of my old tools, and I found my Motion Pro fork oil measure too. So what this is, it's a metal straw, and I've set this to 121 millimeters with this little collar thing, and you drop it inside the fork, and then on the top there's a syringe, and it sucks out the oil level to 120 millimeters where I set it. So it's a pretty cool little tool for getting your fork oil level height correct. Alright, not gonna lie guys, sometimes this is really a pain in the ass. The main thing that's a pain in the ass is this spring sits on a little collar thing down here, and that collar, I don't know if it's just my bike or not, but on my one fork the tolerances are too tight, and so that collar gets bound up in there, and it won't allow you to get the spring down in there deep enough. So I had to use this big old long bent screw to reach down in there and hook on the collar, because it gets wedged in there and it's crooked. And like I said, the spring won't sit down in there far enough for you to be able to get the cap on. And the first time I did this bike, did the springs, I did it in the dark in my driveway with a flashlight in my mouth, and I couldn't figure out why the damn cap wouldn't go on, because you have to pull down a little bit pretty hard to get the cap to screw on. And so I was really struggling, and I know how to do this. I mean, I've done it before, but what had happened is that little collar that sits down in here, I'll show you this preload shim. It's sort of kind of like that. What happened is it bound up in there sideways because the tolerances are so tight, and I was losing that, you know, whatever ½ inch of it being sideways at the top. It's kind of like mounting a tire. You got to have the slack on the other side. So what I did is just now is I hooked that little long bent bolt thing, and I got it to drop down so that I had that slack in the spring. But if you're trying to get your fork cap on and that little collar down in the bottom of this fork, I've never had this happen in my life except for on this bike. If that thing is sitting crooked, good luck. It's a pain in the ass. So you pull the rod up, you slide the spring down. I can't show you, it's a two-handed process. And then you just kind of hold on to this and fish the spring down until you can get the wrench on there. Once you got that, it'll hold the rod into place. And what you're seeing here is this tubing. I didn't have any oil in the fork because I had to get that shim out of there, so I had to drain all the oil out of the fork. And I found this piece of surgical tubing so I could shove it down in the hole so that I could hold the rod up while I slid the spring down without having to put oil in it, because if I put oil in it and it wasn't straight, then I'm starting all over again. I know it's really long-winded and boring, but anyway, if it happens to you, you be appreciative of this video. So I just shoved this tubing down inside there so that I could hold the rod up while I slid the spring down to make sure that it would actually lock. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually removing this tubing, and then I will slide that aluminum damping rod back down inside there, and then I'm going to keep this preload shim out because it was sliding down inside the fork too, and it's only like 2 millimeters, so I don't care. And then I'll just screw the fork cap back on. Okay, so that's all the more you guys need from this video. Make sure that you torque your pinch bolts on your fork correctly. They're 12 and 17 Newton meters. That's really important because it keeps the fork from binding. If you distort the tubes, the fork will bind. Also, your pinch bolts down at your wheel. Make sure that you tighten the axle and then pump the brakes and stuff a few times so that the axle will settle into place. And that also keeps your forks from binding. And one last note, KTM says that these forks do not need the air bleeder. I'm here to tell you that KTM is completely full of shit on that. And I've asked some other suspension people, and they're like, well, KTM says you don't really need them. It's bullshit. When I was screwing off the fork caps, the air released from my fork cap. So they do build pressure in those forks. I don't know, basically my 350 is the same fork and it has bleeders in it, but the 690 doesn't. I think they're just cheaping out and don't want to put the screw in there because the cap costs 10 cents more to manufacture. But anyway, there was pressure in my forks, and I don't know, whatever floats their boat, but I just want to let you guys know that there is air pressure inside those forks that builds up. So that's it for this video. I don't want to keep it too long for you. I won't show you the rest of the reassembly because if you can't take your wheel off, well, then you probably shouldn't be working on your bike or your forks. That's it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. And make sure that you subscribe and go watch the Steg Pegs giveaway video. Still haven't hit 1,200 subscribers yet, but when I do, I'm going to give away those Steg Pegs. So check out this video that I'm going to put here and sign yourself up and by commenting on that video. So yeah, take it easy. See ya.